Welcome. If you're listening, you're probably someone who likes to, really get into complex topics, get those aha moments.
Right, but without feeling completely overwhelmed.
Exactly. That's what we try to do. So today, we're diving into something I think is really fascinating and maybe surprisingly relevant. It's the intersection of mental disability and the academic world.
Yeah, and we're using a really thought-provoking piece. One of you actually sent us, we're just calling it corporal1.pdf for our chat today.
Right. And it gives us this great lens to look at how academia, its norms, its expectations, how those can actually create real hurdles for people with mental disabilities.
And we'll also touch on the mad studies movement, which offers some really critical alternative ways of thinking about all this.
For sure. And I think as we get into this, you might have some of those aha moments yourself, like realizing how assumptions we barely even notice about rationality, participation, productivity, how they might unintentionally push people out.
Yeah, they can marginalize individuals with different mental experiences without anyone really meaning to.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. Where does the source document begin?
Well, corporal1.pdf kicks things off by looking at these key topoi in academia.
Topoi, like common themes or arguments?
Exactly. Recurring ideas that sort of underpin academic talk.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting is how these ideas, which seem pretty neutral, even foundational,
Uh-huh.
how they start to look problematic when you consider the lived reality of someone with a mental disability.
Okay, give me an example, like rationality.
Yeah, rationality and coherence.
That's,
Academia values that, right?
yeah,
Logical, linear arguments.
totally. That's what we're taught.
But the document really pushes back. It asks, is that perfectly neat presentation always the sign of a, quote, stronger mind?
Interesting question.
It points out that for some writers, achieving that kind of flow is a huge struggle because of their disability.
So the very thing we celebrate could be acting as a gatekeeper.
That's the argument. It suggests we might be mistaking a specific communication style for intellectual ability itself.
And potentially missing out on really valuable insights just because they don't fit that neat linear box.
Exactly. And that ties into another big one, participation.
Right. What does participation really look like for a student, say, dealing with severe depression?
Or debilitating anxiety, or someone on the autism spectrum who finds navigating those spontaneous discussions really challenging.
Yeah, the standard seminar format might not work for everyone.
Our typical idea of participation often privileges certain, maybe neurotypical ways of engaging, which can put others at a disadvantage.
Even if they have incredibly valuable things to contribute, just maybe not in that specific way.
Precisely. And the same logic applies to collegiality
Yeah.
among faculty members who might face similar challenges in navigating those social dynamics.
Okay, participation, collegiality. What else?
Yep.
Productivity.
Oh, productivity, the constant pressure. The deep dive really highlights how mental disabilities can impact, well, every single stage. Getting started, organizing thoughts, handling feedback, actually finishing things.
And it's not just about trying harder.
No, definitely not. There can be fundamental cognitive or emotional barriers involved. And importantly, the academic environment itself, with all its pressures, can be the barrier.
That makes sense. It's not just an individual issue.
Right. And it's not only students. The text also mentions things like new security requirements and how they might clash with academic freedom, especially for independent scholars whose status might be precarious, maybe partly because of mental health challenges affecting stable affiliation.
Wow, that's a connection I wouldn't have immediately made. These structural things have ripples.
They really do. And this all kind of sets up the discussion around truth, which we'll get back to later with something called counterdiagnosis.
Okay.
But first, the document makes this really crucial point. Mental disability isn't some kind of rare anomaly. It's described as a regular feature of our contemporary culture.
So it's just part of the human experience, including within academic communities.
Exactly. But, the argument goes, academia often finds ways to push it out, to cast it out of academic discourse.
How? Through what mechanisms?
Sometimes subtly, through really ingrained ways of talking and thinking, like the historical influence of Cicero, his emphasis on right reason, which kind of implicitly links rationality and mental soundness.
Okay, so sort of baked into the intellectual tradition.
Kind of. And sometimes it's more blatant, like simply refusing to provide necessary accommodations.
And the tricky part is that these things are often just seen as normal, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's just how academia works.
Precisely. They're so normalized, it's hard to even spot them as exclusionary practices sometimes.
Which brings us to the idea of listening, I think. The document talks about that.
It does. It acknowledges that scholars like Ratcliffe and Gore have really emphasized listening as a way to engage with difference, which is obviously important.
A positive intention, for sure.
Absolutely. But then it poses this really sharp question. What happens if a student or a teacher seems to lack rhetoricity?
Meaning their communication doesn't fit the expected academic mold of making sense.
Exactly. It challenges whether our usual ways of communicating and understanding are really up to the task of engaging with profound difference.
So it leads to that core question.
Yeah, the author asks it directly. Is it possible to listen to the mad subject?
Wow. That really forces you to examine the limits of our frameworks, doesn't it? Are we truly set up to hear voices that don't conform?
It's a profound challenge,
Yeah.
and it sets the stage perfectly for the next big idea, micro-rebellion and counterdiagnosis.
Okay, so if the usual structures, even listening, can be problematic, how do people push back? Tell us about micro-rebellion.
So the document looks at what it terms textual sites of micro-rebellion, basically specific moments in autobiographical writing where individuals with mental disabilities find really creative ways to talk about their experiences on their own terms.
And it analyzes specific authors.
Yes, it focuses on works by Suzanne Antonetta, Lauren Slater, and Wendy Marie Thompson as examples.
Okay, and through analyzing them, this idea of counterdiagnosis emerges. What's the core concept there?
Well, essentially, counterdiagnosis is about refusing to simply adopt a confessional position about a diagnosis in their writing.
So not just saying, here's my diagnosis, here's how it affects me.
Right. Instead, these authors are described as strategically refiguring those core academic ideas we talked about, rationality, coherence, even truth, but doing it through the lens of their neurotypical experience.
Ah, so they're using their unique perspective to reshape the narrative.
Exactly. The analysis suggests these texts claim academic and cultural value because of the author's neurotypicality, not just in spite of it.
That's a huge shift. It's reframing difference as a source of insight, not just a limitation. That feels like a real aha moment.
It really is. It challenges that deficit model so fundamentally.
And the book uses Lauren Slater's memoir, Lying, as a specific example, right? Particularly her use of the pronoun you.
Yes, that's a key part of the analysis. Slater's use of you is described as really shifting and sometimes deliberately, maybe, incoherent. Well, sometimes you seems indefinite, like one. Other times it seems aimed at specific people in her life story. But the analysis really zooms in on chapter 4, which is titled, Sincerely Yours.
Okay, what happens with you there?
So the chapter reads like a direct address to the reader initially. But then really suddenly, Slater reveals she has a diagnosis of Munchausen syndrome.
Right.
And she immediately inserts these long quotes directly from psychiatric journals saying it's, and this is a quote, so you will understand Munchausen syndrome better.
Whoa, okay, that's unexpected.
Mhm.
So the you shifts from the reader to someone needing clinical explanation.
It seems to. And right after these clinical bits, she drops this line. Well, that should prove my point. You can fake epilepsy.
Wow. That throws everything up in the air, doesn't it? Assumptions about diagnosis, about truth in memoir.
Absolutely. It's presented as a prime example of counterdiagnosis. The shifting you, the abrupt clinical text, that provocative claim, it all works together to subvert what we expect from a truthful, coherent autobiography.
She's almost using the form itself to question the very possibility of a stable, easily diagnosed self.
That's a great way to put it. It forces the reader to question authority, both medical and authorial.
Really powerful stuff. Okay, let's broaden the lens a bit now and talk about MAD studies as a whole field. What is it, essentially?
Sure. So MAD studies is this critical academic field, but it really grew out of the activism of psychiatric survivors and their allies. You see this traced in key texts like Mad Matters or the Routledge Handbook on Mad Studies.
So it has roots in the consumer survivor movement.
Definitely. Its main goal, broadly speaking, is to critique and try to move beyond what it calls psych-centered ways of thinking, basically, the dominant biomedical models of mental health and distress.
So it's fundamentally challenging the status quo in psychiatry.
Yes, while valuing the knowledge and experiences of those who've been through the psychiatric system, those who identify as MAD. The foreword to Mad Matters stresses it's not about creating separation, but about fostering MAD-positive viewpoints.
Centering the perspective of those with lived experience.
Exactly. And it's important to note, as someone like Lucy Costa points out in the Routledge Handbook, it's not like one person or group owns MAD studies. It grew more organically from the ground up.
From that activism against things like forced treatment and other forms of coercion?
Right, that history is crucial to understanding its orientation.
Now, like any developing field, I assume Mad Studies isn't without its own internal discussions or external
Oh,
critiques.
for sure. The Rutledge Handbook is quite open about this. There are ongoing discussions and critiques about things like potential elitism within academia, or whether it focuses too much on perspectives from the global north.
So, issues of representation and diversity within the movement itself.
Yes, and ensuring it fully includes voices from, say, marginalized racial or ethnic groups, or people whose experiences might not fit neatly even within some MAD studies frameworks. Thinkers like Diana Rose and Alison Faulkner have raised these kinds of important points about inclusivity and critical self-awareness.
Okay, and how does MAD Studies differ from, say, anti-psychiatry? Are those the same thing?
They overlap, but they aren't identical. MAD studies definitely includes anti-psychiatry critiques, critiques of the harms and limitations of the psychiatric system.
But it's broader.
Yes, anti-psychiatry often focuses very heavily on dismantling the system. MAD Study shares many of those critiques, but puts a really strong emphasis. The handbook calls it giving pride of place to the lived experiences and the knowledge generated by self-identified MAD people themselves.
And using that knowledge to build alternatives.
Exactly, building alternative ways of understanding and responding to madness and distress from that specific standpoint.
That distinction is helpful. Now, another important concept for understanding this outside a purely medical lens is the social model of disability. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. The social model, which you see discussed in texts like Madness, Distress, and the Politics of Disablement, is a really fundamental shift. Instead of seeing disability as something located in the person's body or mind.
Like an impairment.
Right. It says disability is primarily caused by societal barriers. Things like negative attitudes, inaccessible environments, inflexible structures. It's society that disables people.
Okay, so it's the environment, not the individual impairment that's the main problem.
It's the core idea. Now, applying it directly to mental distress, that's been debated.
Why is that?
Some worry it might downplay the very real subjective suffering people experience, or that it might inadvertently medicalize distress in a different way. So building on that, the concept of psycho-emotional disableism has come up. This focuses specifically on things like prejudice, negative attitudes, internalized oppression, seeing those as key disabling factors for people experiencing mental distress.
That feels important, acknowledging both the internal feeling and the external societal reaction. But there's a kind of catch-22 mentioned, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. The paradox is that right now, if you forego a psychiatric diagnosis, maybe because you reject the medical model, you can actually lose social recognition of your impairment.
And lose access to support.
Exactly. Access to services, benefits, accommodations. So even if you critique the label, not having it can create very practical problems.
That's a tough bind.
It is. And related to this, though distinct, is the neurodiversity movement. It tends to view conditions like autism or ADHD not as disorders to be cured, but as natural variations in human neurology.
Differences to be accepted and accommodated.
Right, while still acknowledging that some aspects of being neurodivergent can be genuinely distressing or disabling in certain contexts.
It really shows how much more complex this is than just ill or healthy. Okay, let's shift to the legal side. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. What's its role here, especially regarding legal capacity?
The CRPD is a major international human rights treaty, and Article 12 is really central to this discussion. It's about equal recognition before the law.
Meaning?
It states clearly that people with disabilities have the right to legal capacity on an equal basis with everyone else.
Okay, and legal capacity means?
The right to make your own decisions about your life, your finances, your health care, and have those decisions legally recognized.
Got it. And Article 12 pushes for a specific approach to this.
Yes, it strongly promotes supported decision-making.
Which is?
It's about providing people with the support and accommodations they need, maybe information in an accessible format, or help understanding options, or someone trusted to help communicate their decision so they can exercise their own legal capacity.
So support to make their own choice, not someone else choosing for them.
Exactly. That's the crucial distinction from substitute decision-making, things like guardianship, involuntary treatment, where someone else is given the power to decide.
And the UN committee overseeing the CRPD has a strong stance on substitute decision-making.
Yes, its position is that substitute decision-making regimes should actually be repealed because they fundamentally conflict with the right to equal legal capacity.
But not all countries fully agree with that interpretation.
That's right. Some countries, including Australia, for example, have lodged what are called interpretive declarations regarding Article 12. They essentially maintain their view that substitute decision-making might still be necessary in some limited circumstances.
So there's still tension there between the ideal and the implementation.
Definitely. Although places like Australia have developed principles, like the national decision-making principles, that are meant to push supported decision-making first and make guardianship an absolute last resort.
But putting that into practice consistently must be challenging.
Hugely challenging. Ensuring there are adequate supports available, proper safeguards against abuse or undue influence, effective monitoring, it's complex work.
And the CRPD covers more than just decision-making, right? You mentioned Article 21 earlier.
Yes, Article 21 deals with freedom of expression and opinion, and access to information. It requires states to ensure people with disabilities can access information in formats they can use technologies they need, and have their diverse ways of communicating accepted.
Which loops right back to that idea of truly listening and making space for different forms of rhetoricity we talked about earlier.
Exactly. It's all interconnected.
Okay. Now, another term that comes up a lot in these discussions is sanism. Can you define that?
Sure. Sanism, as you see it defined in places like Mad Matters or works on law and media portrayals, is basically systemic discrimination against people based on their psychiatric diagnosis or history. It's framed as being parallel to racism or sexism.
A prejudice rooted in ideas about mental soundness.
Exactly.
I-
And it has very real consequences.
Such as, can you give examples?
Well, the literature points to things like being denied access to general health care, being exploited in employment, horrific historical practices like forced sterilization, losing custody of children simply due to a diagnosis, or being seen as vulnerable subjects for research without proper consent.
Wow, really serious life-altering impacts.
Absolutely. And related concepts like the psycarceral complex critique how psychiatric institutions themselves can sometimes function more like places of confinement than healing, highlighting the need for better, individualized, community-based supports.
It paints a picture of deeply embedded societal bias, not just individual attitudes.
That's the core of understanding it as systemic discrimination.
Okay, finally, let's really underscore the importance of lived experience and mad knowledge, which seems central to everything we've discussed.
It absolutely is. It's foundational to MAD studies and the whole survivor movement. MAD knowledge isn't just anecdotes. It refers to the theories, the insights, the understandings that are developed by people who have direct firsthand experience of madness, distress, and navigating the mental health system.
And this knowledge is seen as a valid form of expertise in its own right.
Yes, absolutely. It offers perspectives that are often completely missing from traditional medical or purely academic viewpoints. It's seen as crucial, credible knowledge.
But as you mentioned, getting that knowledge recognized within those traditional systems can be a struggle.
It often is, yes. Survivor researchers can face real barriers in getting their work valued or published in mainstream journals, for example. Their expertise isn't always seen as legitimate.
And there's a risk of it being sort of watered down.
Yes, the risk of co-option is real. MAD knowledge can sometimes be taken up by academic or professional frameworks, but stripped of its critical edge or reinterpreted in ways that don't actually challenge the status quo.
So it's not just about including voices, but about ensuring they're heard authentically and have real influence.
Precisely. The emphasis in the sources is on the meaningful inclusion of survivor perspectives in absolutely everything from designing services to developing policy to conducting research. That direct experience brings an understanding you just can't get any other way.
Wow. Well, this has been incredibly illuminating. We've covered so much ground, from how everyday academic norms can inadvertently exclude, to the rise of mad studies, the importance of the CRPD and rights, the challenge of Sanaism, and ending on the crucial value of lived experience.
Yeah, and I hope for everyone listening, it provides a much more, well, nuanced picture than the simple binaries we often fall into around mental health. It's about structures, assumptions, history, rights.
Yeah.
It's so much bigger than just individual diagnoses.
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought to leave everyone with, building on all this. How might our workplaces, our academic institutions, our communities actually change if we started to consciously question those ingrained assumptions about rationality, participation, productivity?
Mm.
If we really tried to build environments that are more inclusive, more welcoming of the whole range of human mental experience, what role could each of us play in maybe fostering a culture that's a bit more mad positive, both inside and outside those formal structures?
That's a really powerful question to sit with. A lot to think about there.
It is indeed. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We hope these ideas give you some valuable perspective as you go about your own learning and your own work.